Okay, so now we're going to get to talk about two more poems. These ones both have a lot going on, even though they're very simple in some ways. The first one is by Robert Haas, and it's called A Story About the Body. This is an example of a prose poem, and we'll see some of this going on, some of these genre-bending things, where sometimes short prose necessarily might seem like it's poetry, or something that is called a story might seem like a poem, or something that's called a poem might in fact seem a little bit more like a story. So this one's ironically, of course, called A Story About the Body. And one thing that's really fascinating about it is just how much the end of this opens up into possible interpretation, what things symbolize. So obviously the situation here is a young composer maybe is a little bit too shallow to follow through with his apparent lust or love for the Japanese painter, because she had had a double mastectomy. He wasn't able to get over this fact, and therefore at the end, she gives him a sort of peculiar gift, this bowl on his porch that is full of rose petals, but underneath the rose petals it's actually full of dead bees. So people have come up with all sorts of different possible interpretations for what the bowl represents, what the bees represent, what the petals represent. So a few of those that I would like to mention right off the bat are that some people have said that the bowl is that's representing kind of our bodies in a way, and that the petals represent sort of external beauty, and the bees represent the internal thing in regards to the composer that is ugly. So he might think of things like rose petals when in fact he's dead on the inside. That's one way of looking at it. Other ways of looking at it include the idea that bees represent a lost sort of ability to be part of the birds and bees, a lost fertility in a sense. So you can talk about how the dead bees, because bees represent something that typically would be life and spring and vigor and and renewal and all of these sort of things, but these bees are dead. So you see sort of the end of that. Some people say that that's representative of sort of the potentially past her prime nature of the Japanese artist, but I find that to be a little bit harsh an interpretation. I sort of lean more fully towards the idea that the bees sort of represent a lost opportunity for the composer, who wasn't necessarily man enough to step up and be a good person, or to see past what seems shallow on his own. So there's a lot of different possibilities here, and I definitely encourage you to think about it on your own time and to consider, why on earth would this artist have put a bowl of dead bees with flower petals on top of it on this guy who rejected her's porch? What could she be trying to accomplish there? And that's something that you can sort of navigate around a little bit. Was she just trying to sort of mess with his mind a little bit, or is she trying to say something more particular? Okay, so there's a lot going on there. The other poem in this session right now is Year One by Franz Wright. This poem, I think, gets really close to the idea of what I consider to be a definition of poetry. I tend to define poetry somewhere along the lines of the attempt to find truth using language in as efficient a manner as possible. And if that's how you're going to go ahead and define poetry, I think that all the truth that you can have here in this poem sort of opens up and shows just how complex this art can be. So, this poem, Year One, very brief poem, only 6 lines long, but there's a lot going on. For example, the first stanza, that's the first 2 lines, says, "I was still standing on a northern corner." So, first question to ask is, what does the word still mean? Are we talking about still as in not moving, or still as in remaining? So you see here how Franz Wright has already put in something where there's ambiguity. Okay, this isn't vagueness, it's ambiguity, it's multiple possibilities. So I was holding still standing on a northern corner versus I was still standing on a northern corner as if I've been there for a long time. And this multiplicity of possibility is purposeful. And then, of course, you have to consider why is the corner northern. I'll let you try to think through that one on your own. As for the next stanza, that long line there in the middle, moonlit winter clouds, the color of the desperation of wolves. So, let's unpack this a little bit, because this is a complicated piece. So, wolves. We can all picture that, right? Now consider the desperation of wolves. What would that be? The desperation of wolves. Think about that. Wolves, like, out there, it's cold, their numbers are dwindling, maybe they're having trouble finding food. All of these things. All the things that would be embodied in the desperation of wolves. Try to get your mind around that a little bit. Now, what color is that desperation? Okay, it would be easy to say gray, but you don't have to go with gray. You can think of something else. So the color of the desperation of wolves. Okay, so we've got that. So we got the whole tail end of this line worked out, which is pretty complicated. But then that brings us to the first half. Moonlit winter clouds, the color of the desperation of wolves. Here's the big catch. Is the word clouds a noun or a verb? Think about that for a second. Okay, so if the word is a noun, and this is the conclusion that most people jump to initially, this line is a sentence fragment and it's also just a description. So moonlit winter clouds, the color of the desperation of wolves. So you're just saying that the clouds are the color of the desperation of wolves. So the clouds are those things that float around in the sky, and they happen to be the color of the desperation of wolves. Okay, so you got that. That's easy. That's what most people grab onto. But then, there's the interesting way of looking at it as if clouds is a verb. Okay? If clouds is a verb, then this is actually a complete sentence. It's an active sentence, because if it's a noun, then we don't actually have a verb in this sentence at all. So, if it is a verb, moonlit winter is in the act of clouding the color of the desperation of wolves. Got that? So, you have two very different ways of looking at this. It's either an image of moonlit winter clouds the color of the desperation of wolves, or moonlit winter is in the act of clouding the color of the desperation of wolves. So, again, just like the word still in the first stanza, right here, we have multiple possibilities, and Franz Wright is not going to just go ahead and tell us which one is right. And that is not an accident, and it's not a shortcoming. It's purposeful. It's to demonstrate that in language there are multiple possibilities, and that the ambiguity is ultimately more inclusive than just grabbing onto one possible interpretation. Okay? And that brings us to the third stanza. Proof of your existence, there is nothing but. Okay, this one, I think, better than most any other poem, really demonstrates the purpose and value of a line break. Because, obviously, the your, potentially he's talking about a God figure here. So proof of your existence, proof of God's existence, there is nothing. That's very hopeless, right? Like, that's very dark and horrifying, right? But it says there is nothing but. In other words, trying to say that everything is proof of God's existence. So, how does this demonstrate what a good line break is? This is how. If it doesn't break the line after nothing, and it just says proof of your existence, there is nothing but, as if this were prose, then there wouldn't be any mystery there. It would just be saying proof of your existence, there's nothing but. So, everything is proof, and that's it. But by breaking that line, we get that moment of hesitation there, where we have to consider that quite literally there is no proof. Okay, that quite literally there is no proof of a higher power's existence. There is nothing. And we have to deal with the despair of that thought for a moment and consider it in all of its possibility. And then we get the word but, resolving it, showing us that maybe there is hope after all. Okay? So, this poem, composed of these three stanzas, these three little chunks, each of them has multiple possibilities. Each of them is, like I gave that definition of poetry, an attempt to find truth using language in as efficient a manner as possible. And because of their ambiguity and because of how they can be taken in different ways, that actually opens it up. Because truth is sloppy. Truth is messy. It's not necessarily a clear-cut thing where you can just say that a thing is, as it is, and that's end of discussion. It's something that a lot of times has a lot more flexibility to it, has a lot more messiness to it. And I think Franz Wright, yet another Pulitzer winner, does a good job here breaking that down for us.